Good morning, and welcome to Listen to the Whispers, web timing attacks that actually work. First off, I'd like to apologise because this talk was meant to be in person rather than virtual. The reason it's virtual is that my baby daughter was born yesterday morning, 6 weeks earlier than expected. So this wasn't the ideal time to get on a plane to Las Vegas. Thankfully, everyone is healthy and being well looked after, so I've got a little time to talk to you lot about timing attacks. Timing attacks can evoke some strong emotions. They take you into this world where everything is possible in theory and nothing seems to work in reality. They leave you asking, how can something be this powerful and this useless at the same time? How can there be so much research on this topic and so few people applying it day to day? It must be some kind of research trap. And after 10 years of personally avoiding this trap, I cracked, decided to step on it and see what happens. The result was painful. Timing attacks are about answering difficult questions, and I started this research with one question in mind. Does the website I'm trying to hack contain a database cell with a password reset token with a specific prefix? In theory, if I try to guess a password reset token, then the time the application takes to compare my guess with the genuine token in the database should be measurably different depending on how many characters I got correct. And so using those measurements, I should be able to guess the secret token one character at a time, hijack arbitrary accounts on nearly any website, and generally have a good time. Now, I'd seen a write-up using this technique on a real website, but when I tried to replicate it, I discovered the write-up was actually completely theoretical. They never made a proof of concept to test if it really worked. So I thought, okay, I'm going to build my own vulnerable system and hack that instead. And I built the system just fine, but the attack just would not work. And so I went hunting and I found a lab that had been built by someone else to demonstrate this timing attack. And the attack worked really well on their lab. In fact, it worked so well that I became a little bit suspicious, and I decided to have a look at their source code and discovered that their string comparison function was not very realistic. The only reason that the attack worked was that they'd injected this artificial sleep state. So at this point, I'd still gotten nowhere. And as a last resort, I decided to cheat as much as possible and build a local benchmark that took tens of millions of measurements on my own system. And the attack still failed. So that seriously didn't work out. But what it did do was hammer in this concept of the timing divide, the gap between the theoretical threat and the real threat, between the techniques that work inside someone's head, the techniques that work in an academic lab environment, and the techniques that actually work in the wild. No other web attack class has this kind of massive dramatic split between the theoretical and the practical. And the most interesting part of this split is the boundary between the two. If we zoom in on this boundary, then we can see that there's this huge gap full of, well, potentially full of undiscovered viable techniques. We know there's a cutoff somewhere in this range below which techniques don't work because the timing gap that they trigger is too small to measure. But where is that cutoff? Well, during this piece of research, the smallest time difference that led me to a real finding on a live system was 200 microseconds. That's 0.2 milliseconds or 0.0002 seconds. So we've got a lot to cover. I'm going to start by showing how to make timing attacks that work everywhere. Targeting one system is okay, but targeting arbitrary systems with no configuration required is a lot more fun. Then I'm going to introduce 3 novel timing attack techniques, each of which has been tested on tens of thousands of live websites that have bug bounty programs. They're all proven with real-life case studies from those targets, and they're all accompanied with automated open source tooling, leaving you equipped to apply all these techniques for yourself next time you look at a website. After that, I'll launch the CTF, chat defense, and then wrap up, leaving 5 minutes for questions. So how do you make timing attacks that work everywhere? Well, timing attack success comes down to the balance between 2 variables. The signal, which is the size of the delay that you're trying to measure, and noise, which is everything else that affects the response time. If the signal is too quiet relative to the background noise, you won't hear it, and the attack will fail. Now, you can split noise into 2 parts, network jitter and internal jitter. Network jitter is already absolutely notorious for making timing attacks fail. When someone sees a timing attack demonstrated against a local system and says that will never work on a real remote target, they're basically saying network jitter will make that attack impossible. And 5 years ago, that might have been true. But with HTTP 2, network jitter is dead. Web timing attacks are effectively now local because in 2020, a paper called Timeless Timing Attacks showed that HTTP2's concurrency features mean you can place 2 requests into a single TCP packet and they'll get processed at the same time, effectively eliminating the harmful impact of network jitter on timing attacks. That by itself is absolutely huge. But during this research, I realized we can do even better because there is one catch with that technique. It's called the sticky ordering problem. Because both requests are on one TLS stream, one of them has to come before the other, and virtually all websites and all web servers have a bias towards processing and responding to the first request first. The authors address this by adding extra query parameters to the first request so that it takes longer to process that one, and in theory things get back in sync. But this approach has issues which make it unsuitable for use on many targets in the wild. What we need is a universal solution, and we almost already have one, because last year I developed the single packet attack, which withholds a tiny fragment of each request and places that in the final packet. The idea is that last packet is what triggers processing, and by only putting a tiny fragment there, you can complete 20 requests with the final packet, which is great for triggering race conditions. But coincidentally, if you only put 2 requests fragments in the final packet, that makes it really small, which means the TLS decryption size is reduced, and that helps fix the sticky ordering problem. Unfortunately, this technique is not quite generic because some major web servers like Nginx start processing request fragments the moment that they see the HTTP headers. And what that does is it completely makes this technique behave terribly on those targets. Some of these web servers will even reply to your request before you've finished sending it. To handle these systems equally well, what we need to do is coalesce all the request headers into a single packet as well. So this way we've got 2 synchronized packets, and whether the server waits for the last one or starts processing on the first one, we get synchronized execution and a high accuracy timing attack. Making this happen turned out to be extremely easy. All you have to do is take what we've got here, which is the algorithm for the original single packet attack, and add an extra ping frame. This initial sacrificial packet, which, I found this by accident, as you can probably guess. What it does is it acts as a clue to the operating system that we'll be sending a bunch of packets imminently, and it's time to start coalescing things. This simple change made the technique twice as accurate on my Nginx testbed, and this enhanced version is already available in Burp Suite in the free and pro versions, and I'm working with the maintainer of the open source alternative H2 SpaceX to get it there, and I think it will be published there this week. So Now we've solved network noise, that just leaves server noise, which should not be underestimated. This can come from many places, including load on the target server, load on other systems the target is interacting with, and even other virtual systems running on the same physical hardware, which is super common in cloud environments. The best way to tackle server noise is to accept it. It's just going to be there, and amplify the signal so that the signal still stands out. For example, say that you want to use that string comparison attack concept to test if there's a header name starting with x-u, then instead of sending that header prefix once, send it a few hundred times with the same prefix, and that will cause a delay that's several hundred times easier to detect, and that might actually work on a real server. And you can take things even further than that and adopt a denial of service mindset, using techniques like nested XML entities and GraphQL batching and regular expression denial of service to create a massive signal that will stand out through any server noise. Ultimately, a denial of service is just a really easy timing attack. On the flip side, you can try to reduce the noise on the server. This is less effective in general, but it works sometimes, and the approach that I've found that tends to work is embracing performance features like caching. The concept here is that the less time the server spends processing your request, the less time it has to accumulate noise that will then make your measurement fail to reveal anything useful. So if you send requests, if you send the same values in requests multiple times, that can trigger caching, which can help. And you can also try to shorten the code path by doing things like chopping out session cookies if they're not required, or in some cases you might even add things like, hypothetically, if you add a do not track header, that might bypass some analytics code on the server, thereby making your attack more accurate. Of course, we all know everyone ignores that header. So those techniques make timing attacks reliable and also fast. I only sent 5 request pairs to most targets for each technique in this research, going up to 50 to confirm promising findings. As far as the actual response order and response timing analysis goes, ParamMiner will take care of everything for you. But if you prefer to experiment, you can do that with Turbo Intruder, which will give you output that looks something like this. The main thing to note is here, when you're using HP2 with a single packet attack, you want to be looking at the response order. And when you're using HP1, that you're just going to be using the timing, so you need to look at the response ranges. The other thing to note here is that these 2 attacks were both trying to spot the same 0.5 millisecond delay on the same server, and as you can see, the single packet attack detected it very, very comfortably, whereas the time analysis failed spectacularly. So obviously, whenever they support HP2, the single packet attack is the way to go. That is the foundation of timing attacks that work everywhere. The part that there's no formula for is choosing the question that you want to answer. I started my research by using timing for parameter discovery. Vulnerabilities often lurk out of sight in overlooked or forgotten features that can only be accessed via hidden parameters. To discover those, you might use a tool like ParamMiner, which guesses parameter names or header names and then looks at the response to see if they did anything. That means if a valid parameter doesn't change the response, you won't detect it and you'll miss the exploit. So for my first bulk timing attack, I decided to fix this by making ParamMiner look at the response time as well as the response contents. And then I just ran that on the pipeline of 20,000 sites. And to my surprise, this really worked. It revealed tons of parameters and headers that I would never have found otherwise, including some completely crazy ones like a web server that takes a HTTP header called common config, and that's revealed by a 5 millisecond delay, which is triggered by adding the header unless the header value is valid JSON. On another site, I was able to detect a header even though they never actually sent me a response, ever. They always reset my connection, but they took longer to reset the connection if I sent a certain header, which I think it might have been authorization, but I didn't write down the header name at the time, so I'm not sure. It also detects some really useful things, and here's one of them. What do you think? What do you think is happening here? When you see a massive time gap like this, that can indicate a cache. So in this example, we can see changing the value of the ID parameter is causing a cache miss, and changing the value of an arbitrary other parameter is not, we're getting a cache hit and a fast response. That tells us that they're only including certain parameters in the cache key, which means two things. One, they're really likely to be vulnerable to cache poisoning vulnerabilities, because this type of configuration is extremely dangerous and hard to get right. Secondly, clearly they've added the ID parameter to this key explicitly. So that means it's highly likely that that website supports a parameter called ID somewhere on that site. In other words, with timing, you can sometimes detect parameters on different pages. The challenge in this research came from somewhere completely unexpected. It's that time analysis is too powerful. Because almost everything causes a time difference, it's really easy to let your own assumptions lead you to the wrong conclusion. And to illustrate this, because you might find that hard to believe, I'm going to do a live demo. And in the spirit of this presentation, I'm targeting a live remote system. So here, as you can see, we've got a request to a website that I've redacted because it's a live system. I don't control it. I don't even know what country it's in. And if we send this a few times, so I'm going to read out the time that's in the bottom right here, because it's probably too small for you to see. So we're getting this response in about 160 milliseconds, about 165 average. Now, what ParamMiner noticed is that if you send a parameter called exec and you send that, then the response now takes about 175 milliseconds. It's taking about 10 milliseconds longer to send us this response. So at first glance, you might think that maybe this target has a little backdoor and it's trying to execute that as a shell command, and we've got unauthenticated remote code execution on this server. However, that is sadly not the case. One clue is that if you try to send a payload like this old school shell shock payload here, the server resets the connection. It may reset the connection. It's not responding. That's not supposed to happen. Anyway, you get the gist. There's something funny happening when we send this payload, right? I wonder what happens if I do it again. Who knows? Anyway, so I hope that server hasn't just gone down. So that's one clue. The other clue that something a bit funny is happening is that we also see this time delay with certain other parameter names like eval. So what's actually happened here is this is a web application firewall, and what's happening is when it sees a parameter called exec, it thinks that looks suspicious and I'm going to do some extra processing on this request, and that's what's causing the delay that we observed. I'm just going to send one more request to see if this target's up. It is. Great. Okay. So you might think, okay, it's a false positive. Let's give up on this target and move on. But personally, I was intrigued. I wanted to know, well, okay, if we send this once and it triggers a delay, what happens if we send it 10 times? And the answer is this response is now taking 300 milliseconds to come back. So we've slowed it down by like an extra 200 milliseconds. So the next logical question from here is, well, how many times can we specify this, right? Because presumably they're thrashing their CPU analyzing this request. And if we specify it quite a few times, then maybe we can trigger a denial of service. So if I send this, you will see this does in fact take a very long time for the server to apply. So it took just under 3 seconds. So I'll just send this a couple more times. So we had 2.8 seconds, 3.1 seconds, and 3.1 seconds. So now, great, that's a nice denial of service vector, but there's something even more interesting here, because if I just add this parameter a couple of extra times and then send it again, then the response has come back in 2.6 milliseconds. The response has come back 300 milliseconds faster. So now, just through timing, we've learned something else, which is that when we add this extra couple of parameters, we go over some kind of threshold, and clearly we've hit some kind of different code path. So the next logical question now is, well, if they're responding faster, maybe they're doing less analysis on our request. So maybe if we put this payload here that just causes a connection reset or makes the server time out, maybe the payload will get through. It did when I practiced this. There we go. So, using nothing but timing analysis, we found a complete bypass for this web application firewall. That's really quite powerful, and it shows how you can use timing to reverse engineer the server's operation. Now, after I found that technique, it was discovered by some other people, and it has been made. It's been integrated into a cool tool called NoAFPLIS, so go check that out. But that detour, although it ended with a nice finding, it left me wondering how many of my findings were genuine parameters exposing real attack surface. So I did a kind of a case study to try and confirm this issue better. I decided to focus on HTTP headers that enable IP spoofing. So here's an example detection, and you can see here when we send true client IP with a domain name, the response comes back 5 milliseconds slower, but if we replay that request, it comes back fast again. And that is evidence of DNS caching. That 5 millisecond delay that you only get the first time is the web server that we're targeting sending a DNS lookup all the way to the authoritative server for example.com. Their operating system is saving that response in the DNS cache, so the second time round, the network round trip is skipped and the response comes back faster. So by looking for this header and then doing a follow-up test for DNS caching, I found that of my targets, about over the majority had visible, audible DNS caching. I was also able to confirm them with an out-of-band technique, which is looking to see if changing the domain to a domain I control causes a DNS pingback to reach my server. And virtually all the targets that had visible DNS caching also caused a DNS pingback. So we can see that technique is reliable. But what about the other 170 findings? Well, those are pretty legit from the manual sampling that I did. Here's one example. What do you think might be causing this delay when I spoof an IP address instead of a hostname? Here's a clue. When you log into the site and view your login history, they include your IP address and the location associated with that IP. So I think this delay is being caused by my IP getting passed to a third-party geolookup service. And when I pass in a domain name, that's failing the IP address validation on the server, and it's bypassing this network round trip and making the response come back faster. I got a bounty for that one, but the real value there was in the takeaway, which is that time analysis is really good at revealing control flow changes like exceptions. And that realization set me up for the next phase of this research. Triggering and spotting exceptions is a core part of testing for server-side injection vulnerabilities. And with timing, we can do it better. Here's my first finding. You probably recognize this classic SQL injection payload pair, but the response is completely static. It's the response time that gives the game away. I confirmed that issue, and unfortunately when I reported it, someone else had found it first, and you can probably guess why. Plenty of people look for SQL injection using sleep statements, and that doesn't require advanced timing analysis. So overall, we can infer timing is a bad fit for detecting injection into sleep-capable languages, unless the target has a web application firewall or such like that's just blocking sleep keywords. But what about less powerful injections? Well, it's seriously good for that. Here's one example. This is a blind server-side JSON injection detected thanks to a 0.2 millisecond difference in the response time. The hard part with this finding and findings like this is gaining enough understanding to actually exploit them. Here we can see that there's also a client-side JSON injection in the response to us, and that seems like a bit of a coincidence. And exploring it, I saw that if I sent a long key, then the payload that I was sending to them got redacted in the reflection back to me. And crucially, that redaction made the response timing signal revert and go away. So by combining that visible information with that timing data, we can infer that something on the server is parsing the same response that gets sent to us. And that's where their server-side injection is occurring. So it's potentially plug-in analytics software or something like that. Ultimately, I couldn't build an exploit for this target, so I had to give up and move on, but at least we got some understanding of what was happening. My most successful injection probe was for blind server-side parameter pollution, which worked by looking at the response time for reserved characters like hash and non-reserved characters like exclamation marks. But once again, to build an exploit, you almost need to know what to expect. Something I found helped with this is the concept of bug doppelgangers, which is non-blind variations of the same vulnerability. In summary, timing analysis will reveal plenty of server-side injection, but the stuff it finds can be really quite hard to exploit. The majority of my valid exploits during this research came from the third and final phase, when I realized you could use time analysis to detect a vulnerability class that had seemed almost undetectable to me for the last 7 years. Back in 2017, I explored an overlooked type of server-side request forgery. I sent a bunch of websites a request that said, please forward this to my server by placing my domain in the host header in the request sent to their site. If this request then actually arrived at my site, that meant I'd found a misconfigured reverse proxy, which I could then use to plunder their internal network. I had a lot of fun with that research and even ended up exploiting my own ISP by accident because they were man-in-the-middling me, which was rude of them. But I knew that this had a blind spot. It won't detect scoped SSRF, which is where the reverse proxy will only access subdomains of the target company. There's a bunch of ways this can happen, but the result is the same. You've just got a bug that's almost as powerful as regular server-side request forgery, but can't be detected using DNS pingbacks because they either won't be triggered or they won't make their way out of the target's network to the attacker's server. Detecting this is really quite hard. To take this response sample here, we can see they're doing host header validation, but we don't know if they're trying to connect to the specified hostname. To detect scoped SSRF, we need to answer the question, are they trying to connect to the hostname in the host header? And timing is perfectly suited for this, thanks to the DNS caching behavior that we saw earlier. It's that easy. Well, almost, because some targets don't support DNS caching or don't cache failed DNS lookups, but there's an alternative way. DNS labels have a maximum length, and if you go one character over that, the DNS client will either refuse to send the query and the response will come back faster, or they will just time out and the response will take ages to come back. So by combining these two techniques, we can reliably detect almost every scoped SSRF vulnerability in existence. As usual, this looks kind of obvious. In retrospect now, I put it on a slide, but it exposed a lot of vulnerable servers. It exposed hundreds of reverse proxies, which in turn exposed thousands of internal domains. So I decided to automate the follow-up step of finding valuable internal targets. And in ParamMiner, you can run this for yourself using the option exploit scoped SSRF. What this does is it looks up every known subdomain and it tries to access them twice. Once directly like a normal user would, and once through the proxy. And then it will flag if it sees any significant differences in the two responses, such as a missing header. That header might not look like much, but what it means is we found a different route to this destination, and that's where things are going to get interesting shortly. On the surface, this host header guessing strategy is really quite similar to virtual host brute forcing, but the outcomes and opportunities it gives us are very different. The findings fell into 4 main categories, and the first 3 are hilariously easy to exploit. The simplest exploit is where you can see the target from outside but can't directly access it. For example, on one target you could see the DNS record pointing at their SonarQube installation, but the firewall would just reset your connection. But using the reverse proxy, I was able to defeat the firewall by going around it. That's the key use of reverse proxies. You see the defense, then you go round. There's a common variation where the internal system doesn't have a public DNS record, but it does have a private one which the reverse proxy can access. There's a huge number of pre-prod environments exposed to anyone using this technique, but the most interesting targets I found during this research were pre-launch systems that were still under construction. In particular, I discovered an administration console with apparently public access on a seriously cool-looking US government system, which I'm gutted I can't provide any additional details about. I reported that issue, and when the system went live a few months later, the admin console was nowhere in sight, so it looks fixed. I found a similar issue in Red Bull, which is mainly notable because they paid me in cans rather than cash. Other valuable targets are publicly accessible but sit behind front-end servers which enforce inconvenient security rules that block attacks or restrict access to valuable endpoints. On one target, there was an internal admin console that just gave a 403, but by going around that front end, I could access the system and log in as a normal user. The final and most subtle category is front-end impersonation attacks. Front-end servers often add internal HTTP headers onto requests before forwarding them to the back-end. And the back-end trusts these implicitly, which enables a type of attack that's kind of known in pieces but not appreciated as a full standalone bug class. Everyone knows that you can spoof IP address using headers, but few people are paying attention to what else gets transmitted in these headers, and yes, that's 2 real examples from New Relic. In theory, this header behavior is safe, right? Because if an attacker spoofs a header, the front end will just overwrite it. But with a reverse proxy, we can just go round the front end, bypass the header overwrite, impersonate the front end to the back end, and exploit this trust relationship. In addition to being exploitable via reverse proxies, you can also exploit this via unintended direct access to the back end, or with request smuggling, which is how I exploited New Relic in the example on the previous slide a while back, or with header masking or mutation techniques. Front-end impersonation attacks are really powerful, and the only hard part is guessing the names of the internal headers, which is something that timing can help with. So, that's all the techniques I've got for you. We've seen timing analysis is useful for recon, reverse engineering, and finding exploits. If you'd like to try those techniques out for yourself, I've made a small CTF at listentothewhispers.net. For me, this research is only a success if people actually start using timing attacks day to day. I had planned to spend the month after this presentation improving the tooling, but obviously I've got other plans now. But at some point I am going to do this. So if you have any issues with these tools, please let me know and I'll take a look, and I'd love to hear feature requests for them too. As far as further research, I think the most valuable thing you can do at this point with the least amount of effort is finding valuable questions that time analysis can be used to answer, and also looking at specific frameworks and servers to find widespread signal amplification techniques which may make things like that string comparison attack actually possible on those targets. For defense, don't use wildcard routing in reverse proxies. It's not a good idea. In general, basically, when you're coding an application, assume attackers have full visibility on your server-side execution flow. They can't read your variables, but they can see which branches your code has taken and maybe things like how many iterations each loop is going through. If someone reports proof of concept using only timing-based evidence, then, well, yeah, ask for evidence, but patch it anyway because your security should not rely on noise. And if you're configuring a server, you can break the single packet attack using a micro throttle as a defense in depth measure. There's lots of further reading available. If you just go to the white paper on portswigger.net/research, that contains all the other links on this page. If you enjoyed this talk, you may also like the following two talks from my colleagues. Gareth is talking this afternoon, and his talk will leave you terrified of email addresses. And Martin's talk tomorrow is going to cause some panic among certain CDN vendors. The three key things to remember are that web timing attacks can answer some seriously difficult questions. The single packet attack makes them local, universal, and feasible. And the murmurs are always there. They're just waiting for you to listen. I'm going to take a couple of minutes of questions now, and if you have any more after that, feel free to chuck me an email. Don't forget to follow me on X. Thank you for listening.
Folks, we do have a couple minutes for questions. If anyone has any, make a single file line on all the three microphones, and you should be able to hear you. James, can you hear him?
Yeah, I can't hear any questions, no.
Test, yep. Thanks for the presentation, and congratulations on the addition to your family. I'm wondering about the WAF bypass that you had discovered. Were you able to identify the vendor and let them know, and is there a fix in works, or what's the deal with that?
I believe that server was a big IP. I was planning to notify them, but this technique was published by someone else a couple of months ago, and basically it works on a lot of web application firewalls. If you Google that tool, no WAF please, you'll find it works on virtually all of them. It's absolutely crazy. Yeah, if you're using any firewalls, I would recommend taking a look deep into the settings and seeing if you can find this request an analysis limit and maximize it or switch it off.